Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's People Science webinar, How to Shop for a CRO, a Strategic Framework for CPG Brands and Ingredient Suppliers. My name is Sarah Burden. I'm the Senior Director of Sales here at People Science. I'll be your host today, guiding you through our main sections and moderating our live panel discussion later in the hour. Before we dive in, a bit of housekeeping. We want this session to be as interactive as possible. Gilmar from our team is active in the chat right now to help keep things lively. The chat function is open for you to share with other participants today. And if you have questions or comments for our speakers, please use the Q&A function. We are also recording today's session. Keep an eye on your inbox later this week, and we'll be sharing the full webinar recording, presentation slides, and an interactive CRO comparison worksheet to help you evaluate your upcoming projects. We have an incredible lineup of industry experts joining us today. To break the ice and ensure that you know exactly who's in the room, I'm going to pass the mic over to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share about their backgrounds. We'll start with you, Dr. Jacqueline Jacques.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am, as you just said, Dr. Jacqueline Jacques, and I am the president and co-founder of Thrive Advisory Group. We are a boutique advisory that works at the intersection of science, innovation, and strategy. We often tell people that what we do is help companies across the entire wellness spectrum commercialize science. So my background, 27 years in the natural products industry. I've been a consultant, advisor, founder, and have worked as an executive inside a couple of brands like Thorne for about 9 years in Metagenics. So been around a while in all parts of the industry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacqueline. Next up, Sheena Smith.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sheena Smith. I spent about 10 years at Thorne in their clinical research department, designing and running studies, and recently moved over to the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, where I'm the senior manager of research operations and focusing on a couple of projects to research that is defining and personalizing health span.
Wonderful. And next, my colleague, Paige.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paige Oliver. I am the director of product at People Science. I've been working in clinical research for over a decade on the pharmaceutical side, and more recently at People Science on the CPG nutraceutical dietary supplement side with ingredient suppliers and brands. My focus is really on the enablement of decentralized clinical trials, which I know Sarah's going to get into later, and using tech to make research faster, cheaper, but still high quality.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. To set the stage before we analyze proposals, let's align on a few acronyms you're going to hear today that really dominate the clinical research landscape. First is CRO. So what is a CRO? A contract research organization. A CRO is a specialized partner hired to conduct clinical research for you. They will handle your protocol design, participant recruitment and management, statistical plan, and data analysis. Next, we have an RCT, randomized controlled trial. This remains the comparative gold standard. Participants are randomly assigned to an active group or placebo group to clearly isolate efficacy. And a DCT is a decentralized clinical trial. This is a siteless study model that moves the trial activities outside of a physical hospital or clinic and directly into participants' homes using digital health tools and remote monitoring. A gold standard RCT can be run in a decentralized fashion as a DCT. To help us tailor the depth of the conversation today, we're going to do a quick little Zoom poll, and Gilmar, the man behind the scenes, is going to launch that for us. So tell us how experienced you are with clinical research. Are you very experienced? You've worked with multiple CROs and universities, you've managed clinical trials. A little experience, maybe you've been on teams that have run a trial, or no experience. This would be your first time shopping for or engaging with a CRO. Let us know. Okay. All right. We have a lot of experts in the house. We've got a lot of people who've worked very closely with multiple CROs and some who are new. So that's excellent. We'll have a rich conversation today. With our baseline set, I'm thrilled to hand the floor over to Dr. Jacqueline Jacques. Jacqueline will take us through part one of our strategic framework, detailing exactly how to define your commercial goals before you ever start looking at quotes. We'll go till about half past the hour with this portion of our webinar. So you can take it away, Jacqueline.
Okay. How to shop for a study. We're going to walk our way through this. And I really appreciate being able to talk on this. This is actually something that I feel like I speak to at least once a week in my day job. And this is really the top line is a thing that we ask our clients all the time at Thrive. And I think hopefully is the question that you're asking yourself if your company is looking at planning a clinical trial is what is your commercial goal, right? It's really great, to be thinking about science in terms of science alone. But if you're operating a business and it needs to be profitable and you need to see, those profits in certain parts of your business, say for a flagship new ingredient or a really important finished product in your product portfolio, starting with the question of what are we trying to do and how is it going to move the needle on our business is often one of the most important things that people need to be considering right up front. So it's not just that we need clinical data, but what are you going to do with that? And what are you going to be able to say about that at the end of the day? So a few other points from this is the data's purpose, when you're thinking about it, one, think about how this becomes part of your intellectual property. So I'm fond of saying, and people who know me have probably heard me say this multiple times, is that clinical trial data is become the new patent in our world for dietary supplement ingredient companies and brands. Sometimes they actually truly become part of a patent if it's the right kind of data focused in the right space. But really, this becomes a moat around your formulation as well. It's a proprietary thing that you own that is specific to your ingredient or your product. If you're looking at selling your company, many people are. It's actually becoming really common for how much clinical trial data you have and what is that showing to become a very important question around business valuation and how it's being looked at in deal flow is something that we're hearing about more and more. For example, we find a lot of times, even from investment bankers, that they will be advising companies that are looking to sell, to add a clinical trial to their intellectual property before they put the company up for sale. So it's becoming increasingly important there. Competitive edge, transparency is the word on the street these days. Even consumers are asking for data. They want to see it. They want to understand, why is your ingredient, product, etc., better than something else. This also is a part of winning the war in terms of how things show up in SEO and how they're showing up in searches with AI. So clinical trial data is becoming important across the entire ecosystem of how consumers actually shop. Retail readiness, we do see this. Places like, Whole Foods want to know how you're substantiating your product, and either at the ingredient level or the clinic or the finished good level, that is important. And finally, marketing content. This is a point of differentiation for a finished good, for example. This can be the difference between having to base everything you say about your product line by line on individual ingredients versus being able to make claims on your entire finished product at the end of the day. So, Sarah, I think that takes us here, and we can go to the next slide. So, design versus cost. One question we get from companies a lot is how should we think about budgeting for a research? Like how should we think about it? If you've never done it, it's kind of like if you've never shopped for a house, you've never shopped for a car. You may not know if you need, $10,000 or $100,000 or $1 million. People really don't have, if they haven't done this before, they may not have a good perception. And I think this is a pretty good way of thinking about it. There are services that you can hire if you just want to do a literature review or a gap analysis. Those things can be fairly low in cost, from a few $1,000s, maybe up to $25,000 or $30,000. If you're just looking for consumer perception, also can be a pretty lean budget and doesn't take very much time, maybe 30, 50, up to, upwards to maybe at the top, maybe $100,000, depending on the length and the complexity of the questions. Smaller pilot studies also tend to be a little bit leaner. They're faster in time, maybe around 6 months to get something like that conducted. And this seems like a pretty reasonable price, even from what I've seen. $75,000 to $150,000 is reasonable to kind of get that early pilot data or signal. And then if you're looking at, a full randomized control trial, these numbers here for a whole RTC, I'm going to say these would be numbers that I would associate with a decentralized trial. 9 months also for a decentralized trial. If you are talking about, the full range of what we see for RCTs, that $250,000 on the low end, and maybe 9 months on the lean side of time, up to $1.5 million and a couple of years on the other end of the spectrum. And next slide. And just a question. I don't know. I see questions popping up, but I'm assuming we're waiting on those until the end, Sarah. I think that's correct. I'm going to keep talking unless someone tells me
Keep
otherwise.
going. I'll answer some of these in the chat here.
Okay. All right. And Paige, I'm going to hand this one to you. Thanks.
Yeah, so when you're thinking about kind of the design, budget, timeline for your studies, one of the things to think about is the execution of it. Are you looking decentralized versus in clinic? And when you're thinking about the quality of the research, there usually is not a difference. So decentralized trial is going to be just as high quality in terms of the data that you're getting. And actually, in some ways, it'll be less expensive and higher quality because you're going to get a real world footprint of what your product or your ingredient is doing with consumers in the market. You're going to get a more diverse participant pool within the kind of consumer demographic that you are looking to sell into. You're going to have higher retention generally because it's less burden on the participant to participate from their home. This also can go up, this retention or actually the adherence to the protocol can go up when you're using the right technology in your study. So, how are you enabling reminders, notifications, communication with the study team? How are you collecting that data in such a way that it is not burdening the participant in their day-to-day life? And then also the data integrity. If you are using a decentralized model versus way back in the day, we used to use paper and pen to do all of our data collection. In a decentralized model, more tech-enabled research study, that's automated real-time collection. As a sponsor of research, somebody who's overseeing a CRO, in a decentralized model, usually you can see that in real time. So you're seeing the data come in. You can go into a portal and see, okay, how is my recruitment going? What's my compliance level? So that you can have those conversations with your CRO to say, what's the health of my study right now? So those are all things to think about in the selection of your CRO when it comes to the actual execution of the trial.
I'm going to add one small thing to what Paige just said that was super helpful. Thanks, Paige. Is also recruitment. I would add recruitment to that. Is if you're limited by geography because you have a CRO that is in city X or location X, depending on the kind of population that you're trying to recruit for your trial, it can add significantly to the time and the difficulty in recruiting for your trial. So that's part of a timeline consideration and sort of ease of finding the right fit for who you're studying in your clinical trial that I would add to this set of considerations for everyone. So next slide. So things to ask yourself before you're shopping for a CRO. So we kind of talked about one of the first things, which is what's your goal? Like setting that goal in advance, also setting your budget so you have some idea of, whether you're going to have like a few $100,000 to spend or whether you've got a much bigger budget. Maybe you're planning more than one trial. So just really understanding those goals. Are you trying to actually, develop valuable IP for your portfolio, or you're more focused on having marketing claims? I mean, if marketing claims are your goal, it may be a much lighter lift. If you're really preparing your company for an exit in the next couple of years, you may want to be thinking about something much more robust that's going to add to your valuation and provide more of an IP moat for your company. Nice to haves versus must have endpoints. So it's always good to have the end in mind, right? When you're thinking about a clinical trial, thinking about like, what are the most important things for us to be able to demonstrate, prove, say at the end of the day? And do we have, a reason to believe that we're going to be able to get there? I think that's something important to take stock of in advance. What's your deadline? You may not have one. Some people don't have one. They're like, we're just going to do this. And when we have results, that's great. But for example, I'll come back to, say, a company preparing for a significant product launch or hoping to put your company up for sale in the next 12 to 18 months. You might say, gosh, we need data in 9 months, or we need data in under 12 months to align with, a big product launch that we're having, or we need to have this study complete and have the data ready to, share its supply side global, so, really understanding what your own deadlines are is important when you're having these conversations. I think I mentioned budget already, and then formulation is really good to think about. Especially if you're doing something like studying a new diet, a new ingredient, right? And maybe you're looking at, do we really have this in the final form that we want it? Or you might have some considerations of, are we putting this into a capsule or a powder or a liquid? All of those things should be ideally decided and aligned on as early as possible. All right, next slide. Okay, now the fun part. Whoop, we just flashed right forward. But I think what that was how do you actually go through this? How do you do your diligence on a CRO? I think that's a really critical question. So next slide, there we go. This is something that at Thrive, I've walked clients through quite a bit, and I think it is a good exercise. I would honestly tell people, if you've never done a clinical trial, this may not be an analogy that rings with everyone, but I tell people to treat it like getting bids on the first time you do it. Think about it like you would with, doing an addition on your house, or, is get a couple of quotes, because that will give you some perspective on what this looks like. But I'm going to walk you through some parts of this based on things that I have learned and seen and experienced, and hopefully this will help people in that process. So we mentioned recruiting after Paige spoke a little bit. What is the recruiting strategy? How is it being done is another part of that question. So not just the geography question, which is quite different, as I said, between a decentralized trial and one being conducted in an on-site clinical facility, but how are they doing it? Are they relying on third parties? Is it going to be, through an agency? Does the CRO get involved in recruiting themselves? Is there any ability, you might want to know for yourself as a company, do you have an ability to help support recruitment? So lots of things that I think are important to ask there. What's the technology being used? So is data collection centralized? Is it digital? Is it clinic-based? How is this, playing into participant retention? So, even a very like a simple part of this is like a really clunky and difficult format for responding to questionnaires, for example, can be the difference between people doing those and being compliant with them, or giving up halfway through, and you end up with very incomplete data, or people dropping out because that interface for them is too difficult to handle. Behavioral expertise. So does the CRO understand not just tracking biomarkers, but how to track real world behavior? Because especially in this industry, those are often our most important outcomes, are not actually lab values, but are things like validated instruments like questionnaires, and even self or internally created tracking devices along those lines, so that being able to track that data is just as important and occasionally more important than lab biomarkers. Next slide. So some of the other must-ask questions. Category fit, I want to spend a minute on this. this has gotten easier over the years, but I think it still is something that everyone really needs to understand. And is that even your clinical trials have to be in alignment with industry regulations within the US. So DSHEA still applies here. We have seen increasing numbers of examples where the agencies have actually even commented on study design and said, hey, company X, based on the design of your clinical trial, it is very clear to us that what you have here is not a dietary supplement, but it is a drug. So it's best to avoid that from the beginning with proper design of the study, and it is usually going to be easiest for people to get agreement on what that looks like if you are working with a CRO that is experienced in studying dietary supplements and dietary ingredients. I'll also mention this can play into IRB. So an IRB is your review board. They are an independent body that gets involved in sort of the review of the study. It's like peer review, if you think about it that way, for a clinical trial. I'm trying to think of the simplest way to describe an IRB, but boy, you want to know if your CRO has IRBs that they already work with that are experienced in working and reviewing dietary supplement studies, because I have even personally had experiences of IRBs that did not understand this, and they try to kind of push you towards safety requirements and other things that are really only involved for necessary for drug studies. So, and that can become a real pain point if you don't have the right IRB. Endpoint strategy. Are your endpoints tied to, again, your desired commercial output? Are they going to be things that you can state in language that's going to make valuable claims for you versus just being academically interesting? So again, thinking about this and how when you're working with the CRO, you are moving the needle towards what your actual commercial goals are and not just to something that's going to be an interesting scientific footnote. Data ownership, had this one come up before too. Really making sure that you own the data should be an important part of the question, or at least understanding who does own it. Is the raw material, is the raw data yours? Is all of the IP yours when the study completes? Are there pieces of this that could, in the, say in the event of a sale of your company or other transaction, be contested as to who the IP belongs to? Publication records, where do they usually publish? Depending on, again, what type of company you have, where you're kind of playing in the natural products ecosystem, this may be more or less important to you. Some people really want, a highly scientifically rated journal. Other people really just want to be able to show that they have published. Is your journal going to be defensible if you get questioned by the FTC? Things like that become important questions. And also sort of some more minor details around study quality, pre-registration. Will you be publishing your trial publicly on clinicaltrials.gov? How is it being powered oh gosh, this could be a whole topic. How is it being powered is a whole topic. I have to say that in somebody who's also, I do peer review as well. I will say this out loud here. And I also do some judging for some of the industry-wide awards where I get to see many, many examples of clinical trials in this space that have been designed and underpowered, and sometimes frustratingly, it's very, very clear in many studies I see that they probably would have reached statistical significance if they had just had a few more participants in them. So being properly powered, making sure that the CRO you're working with has the right expertise in-house to help you do this and even account for things like what your potential dropout rate might be, is a very important part of having the right CRO relationship. Next slide. So a few things that are red flags to take a look at, recruitment delays. I have seen these, gosh, particularly I've seen them, I don't want to pick on universities, but I've particularly seen them at universities where even in my own career, we have experienced very, very long recruitment delays. Or I have a colleague actually who's been, her company is in the process of recruiting for a trial right now with an on-site clinical CRO, and they've had just a very, very long and difficult process recruiting. So I think this is, that question that we asked earlier of, how are you accessing your target population? How are they being recruited for? And what is the ease of getting to that particular population? And again, I think I mentioned this in the last slide, but also accounting for realistic dropout rates is something that should be taken into account really in study design, and important to think about there. And then this thing that we call the clinic tax. So I just saw this again, recent things I've seen. Some CROs have made investments in, say, very expensive diagnostic equipment and things that they may have to, they might have pressures from their business to be using those things in as many clinical trials as possible, which may show up as an expensive line item for you, and something that you have to weigh the value of that data against the cost of using it. Next slide. Okay, this is actually a sterilized real world example from an exercise that I went through with a client. So I had a client in this case who had they were very new to clinical trials. They did have a budget for it, but they really wanted to understand what their sort of proposed clinical trial design would look like under different models. So we created a dossier and we sent it out to a group of different CROs, and we got all of the study proposals back and we laid them out in a spreadsheet. Actually, this is a very short, tight summary of my spreadsheet. And then we sat in a meeting and we looked at them as a comparison. So in this case, how much do I want to disclose here? Two of these, CRO B and CRO D, were both very traditional CROs. So in clinic model for what they were doing. And again, they were getting the exact same study design from us to give this quote. So even if you just look at those are basically essentially similar kinds of CROs, but their length of time for completing was very different. So quite a bit longer than the other two that we'll talk about in a minute. Different recruiting strategies, very different behavioral endpoints. So in particular, the one that you see over there that has the much bigger price tag of the like 1.5 million, their original study design that they gave back to us did not actually even have behavioral endpoints in it, whereas the other had just a single quality of life tool. And, the differences were kind of significant beyond that, particularly for the one much more expensive outlier CRO. There were several endpoints that were based on some equipment that they had ownership of in their facility that were, they were applicable to the study design, but they were far from necessary, is what we sort of determined after looking at the quote at the end of the day. In this case, CRO A and C are both what we would put in a decentralized model, and also, again, very, very different. So you can see obviously much lower cost, and that is common when you see the differences between a decentralized clinical trial and an in-clinic CRO. Shorter timelines are fairly normal as well. So that more like 9-month timeline is fairly similar, but there were a lot of other differences here. So particularly recruiting, very different, an internally owned database versus simple social media recruiting. That can make a big difference again in ease of recruiting, and speed of recruiting can be very different between those two. The endpoints also being significantly different in this case, one being really the much more robust kind of endpoints that we were looking for in this case versus only survey, and some a real difference again also on biomarkers, with one of these CROs offering extensive depth and availability of biomarkers and the other not offering them at all. So I think that kind of covers this mostly, other than just to say, like, I just think this is a good snapshot of what you see in terms of the variables, across the spectrum. I think the other thing I would summarize on this slide is to say that there's a way in which a cost of a clinical trial has become, or is really, just uncoupled from the value of what you get out of it. Faster and lower cost does not necessarily, in fact, in many cases, it should be very clear that it does not make a study less scientifically valid or more robust. And in fact, what we have seen in many of the exercises like this that we've done is that we can actually get a much more robust trial in a decentralized model at a much lower cost and much more quickly than we can in a traditional clinical model. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go down a traditional clinical route, but I would say that I wouldn't just assume that because something is more expensive that you're getting the more, luxury model for the whole study. Okay, next slide. To kind of bring this down to a summary, always starting internally in your company with, why am I doing this? Is this for a claim? Is it, for our new product launch? Is it something that we're really looking to add, strategic or intellectual property value to the company to increase our overall valuation? That should help you answer some questions such as, what is our timeline? What is our budget? And really plays an instrumental part in establishing your goals for even starting the process of planning a clinical trial. Hierarchy matters. Does your claim actually need an RCT? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes what you really need is more of a consumer perception study. Sometimes you're not ready for an RTC and you should be looking for a small exploratory pilot study. So understanding where you are in that process is another important question to ask yourself. Framework comparison, when you're evaluating and talking to a CRO, having some of these questions so that you can compare recruitment, you can compare technology, you can compare what kind of outcome measures they're able to put into your study because they have the expertise or the equipment or the access to those measures. Time is money, so making sure upfront you are aligned not just on budget, but also on what these timelines look like can be really vital, again, if you're trying to meet a timeline like a product launch or another critical date for your company. And and the endpoint strategy as well. So can it be run as a DCT? Many can. There are some cases where clinical trials, don't fit a DCT model. So, we don't want to ever really be in the situation of trying to, cram a square peg into a round hole. Increasingly in this space, especially because of technology, DCTs do let us do kind of everything plus, but it doesn't mean that there aren't still a number of cases where a traditional CRO model may not be the best fit for what you're trying to do. I think it's great that the team here is going to send out a nice worksheet after this webinar for everyone to have access to. So thank you for that. And I think that might get me to the end. That was the last one. All right. Thank you all so much. And I think we get to have a little panel discussion now.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was incredible. Thank you, thank you. You gave us so many strategic nuggets. We're going to transition now to the live panel portion of our presentation. And so we're going to get rid of the slides. And we can dive into some of the complex real-world tensions that arise when shopping for a CRO partner. So you can ask questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to all of those. Okay, my first question is for Sheena. Sheena, So ingredient suppliers have one kind of goal when they're constructing their clinical trial. They have a B2B goal. They're trying to impress the R&D folks at a CPG brand. CPG companies have a different kind of goal. They want to appeal to the consumer. And want a structure function claim for the finished product label. How can suppliers design studies that CPG brands can actually use? And how should they evaluate the supplier's science, a CPG brand evaluate the science when they are choosing?
Thanks, Sarah. That's a really good question to be thinking about. I think from the ingredient supplier side, thinking about what the CPG brand is going to need to do with that study and designing for that. So being aware of what those desirable claims are and the target market as well, so that you're designing a study that is applicable. And Jacqueline already covered, so I'm just going to repeat, keeping Duchenne in mind with your study designs. So if you're designing a study, for instance, in a population with a disease, it might be easier to run the study, but no one in the supplement industry is going to be able to talk about it. So that's going to inhibit the ability of that company to use your work, and that makes it less valuable. So keeping in mind study design and that would apply for the CPG company running their own studies as well. Design the study for the claims that you need and the market you want to speak to, so that that's who is in your study. For the quality piece of it, I think larger studies are always better, but I think diversity is actually more important than that. And that to some extent is, again, aligned with your target audience. So if you are marketing to a very small subset of elite athletes who are, of a certain age, and maybe they're all male, they're all female, your study can be very targeted. But if you want to market to the general public, then your study shouldn't be very targeted. So a study with 30 healthy 20-year-old men is not going to generalize to 35-year-old women with kids and a desk job. So keeping in mind that the study should align with that. Another thing to look at when you're evaluating some of the work that the ingredient companies have brought you is what kind of significance are they presenting? So in some cases, statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean clinically significant. So you see, our product helped people lose a half a pound in a year, and it was statistically significant. That's great, but nobody at home is going to care about a half a pound in a year. It's not really clinically significant. So that's something else to look at. And something outside of the studies that I would suggest, if you have the means, is to glance at the existing scientific literature, if there is any, and see how much conflicting evidence there is. So if there are 4 studies that say this doesn't do anything, and there's one study that says this is great, dive into those studies and find out, and this is where it gets hard, find out, is it because some of the studies weren't designed well, or they were in completely different populations, so they're apples and oranges, or is it because maybe there was a little bit of selective reporting happening or something like that? Let's see, was there something else I wanted to say? Oh, no, I think I answered your question. Thanks.
You did. No, those were great points, Sheena. And you can tell your expertise that you have been in the trenches and lived this. Thank you so much for that very thorough answer. Paige, do you have anything that you can chime in on about how either ingredient supplier companies or CPG finished brands can kind of evaluate the science that a CRO partner might have published to figure out whether that would be a good fit?
Yeah, I think Jacqueline also touched on this with what she brought up with what journals is a CRO publishing in? What level of credentials do they have on their team? What kind of research have they typically done? So, have they mostly done sleep research? Have they done a lot of research in gut microbiome? Have they done research in GLP-1. So those are things to look at within the expertise of that CRO. Are they going to be able to help you design a study that is DSHEA compliant, that is going to help you with whatever your commercial goals are, and also bring in that scientific rigor within the therapeutic area that you're interested in? Um, and just to kind of tap into what Sheena was also saying too, when you're thinking about the design of the study and the quality that you're looking for those commercial goals, I would also bring in timeline. If you create a study that is disease oriented with a nutrition, like an ingredient or a dietary supplement, the IRB may come back and say that you need an IND. This should be submitted to the FDA because they think it's a drug trial. That is going to push everything back. So having a CRO that knows how to design that study is also going to help you from a timeline perspective and a price perspective.
Great points. Great points, Paige. Thank you so much. Jacqueline, something I'm riffing off of something you shared in your portion, that we don't want to be underpowered, because what if you were just a few participants away from achieving statistical significance? Is it possible, though, for a study to be overpowered? Should we just add dozens and dozens more in order to prevent against that?
I mean, I think Sheena said this nicely. She said, bigger is usually better, right? But I mean, it's also more expensive. So, if you have an infinite budget, like do a bigger trial. That's great. But it's just no, it's going to cost incrementally more money, and often people are surprised by that they can properly power a study at a smaller number than they think they can. I think it's a really, and like, don't just go with the biggest number out there. Like, that's not necessarily true. You can get, it really depends so much as why you need an experienced CRO and you need like the right statisticians and people in-house because what you want is, in my mind, most of the time is appropriate power. So the frustrating side of that tends to be when you can really look at a study and go, oh gosh, probably if you had five more people in this study, it would have been statistically significant. And again, that also factoring in what the average dropout rate is another important, having that buffer there so that if two people drop out, you don't drop below statistical significance because you've lost two people. That is very frustrating when you see it happen.
Sticking with that thread, back to you, Paige. If there's a budget constraint, and a brand only has a budget for a small pilot study, is an underpowered trial better than no trial at all? And follow up, if a trial misses its primary endpoint, is there any salvageable commercial value from that data?
Yeah, so to answer the first part, is some data better than no data? I would say largely yes. So depending on your commercial goals, if you're trying to show investors that you need more money to do more research to make those claims, having a pilot is super powerful because you can say, we ran this with 20 individuals and we got really deep data. And no, it's not powered, but we can show individual variance within an individual, like an individual's change. So we're not looking at population change, or this gets into how you're powering the study and how it's structured, but you can say basically what are we seeing within an individual? And then you can design a better study once you have the funds to do that. So I always say a little bit of data is better than no data at all, so you can make data-driven decisions. And then getting into kind of the question around, and I'm gonna rephrase this, Sarah, from what you said of kind of like if you don't meet your primary endpoint, if you don't have statistical significance, is that a total loss? And no, it's not, because you still have valuable data hidden within that study. So it might not have been your primary endpoint, but if you want to do future research, there's so much that you can pull through different subsets of the demographic pool that you're in. So maybe women ages 30 to 50 saw a significant leap in that primary endpoint. And no, it's not powered, it's not statistically significant, but you are seeing a large gap so that you can run a study specifically within that cohort and maybe do marketing claims just targeted at that demographic population. So it's, again, some data is better than no data. There's also some value if you're doing a study and you don't see results to find out other things that are going on within your business. We've seen manufacturing issues that have been highlighted from running pilot studies. So if you're running a study and we see the data is kind of messy from this small pilot, oh, you need to have a conversation with your manufacturer to make sure that you have the right quality controls and good manufacturing practices in place. So there's a lot of other information that can come out of studies, even if you have what you would call a null value.
Those are great points. Thank you so much, Paige. Question back to Jacqueline and then Sheena. When we were looking at proposal frameworks, is there a certain spot on a proposal that you expect to see budget creep? And if so, what does your mind go to when you're evaluating a proposal? I'll start with you, Jacqueline.
Where I expect to see budget creep, like from an anticipated way. I think, probably where I've seen it most is that space with like, we have this fancy machine and we're trying to justify using it in your clinical trial. Like, especially in the cases where we have not asked for that. So, like, I've seen that just show up and I'm like, we didn't even ask for this as part of our outcomes, and why is this here? That's probably my number one that I can think of is like just unnecessary measurements and instruments put into a trial that aren't necessarily in alignment with the company's goals.
Great point. Sheena, is there anything that would jump out to you when you were looking at a proposal that you'd be like, that's not going to be the final?
The first thing that comes to mind for me has to do with the people in the study. So recruitment, retention, and completion. So if you come to a CRO and you say, I want to study with 100 people because you've figured out your power or you've come to that conclusion that you need 100 people, and you haven't had a conversation about how many people that means you need to actually recruit, then the CRO may recruit 100 people. And by the time you've lost some and people haven't completed all the steps, maybe you're down to 70 data sets at the end. Is that still going to be powered? Is that still going to give you what you need? Or did you just spend all that time and money and effort to end up short? So being very, very clear about recruitment, what is the plan for if people are dropping out faster than you expect or more than you anticipated? How many more is the expectation to have to enroll in order to get the final count that you want at the
Oh, I think we're having a little audio issue from Sheena. Thank
That
you,
did, that
Sheena.
did make me think of one more thing though, just listening to her talk. I think
Yeah.
one of the other ones that comes up that we see a lot is sort of the frequency of data collection can show up often as not just an additional expense, sometimes when it's more than is needed, but also can be a pain point for participants if you're not being thoughtful about that. And that can apply both to things like, actual like blood draws and things like that, but also even to validated questionnaires. I mean, like thinking about like, are we asking people to fill out a 20-minute questionnaire every day, for example? Like that's going to cause people, some number of people to just get fatigue and drop out of your study. So I think those are also important things to look at.
Yeah, and I've got one more that's not necessarily related to the CRO, depending on your arrangement, but the cost of a placebo. So you want to do an RCT, and that's really the right thing to do, and it's what you need for your study, but we don't have a placebo. So that's one of those kind of hidden costs that you might not think about until someone says, okay, where's the bottles? And you don't have them.
I'm so glad you mentioned it. It is something that people do not always plan ahead on. So I'm really grateful that you mentioned it. Um, Jacqueline, another question for you. How should AI-driven search factor into what a brand is thinking about when they're planning for an RCT or DC?
Can you refine that a little bit? Like if I'm, are you saying like for, actually doing my study design or for looking
Or as you're consulting with your clients, are more and more of their clients finding them via AI search versus SEO these days? And sort of how should they think about that with
That's what I
studies?
thought. That's what I thought the question was. I just wanted to make sure. I think it is something um, that is becoming more important. It's very clear that AI, and I think this is true whether you're using, Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your preference is. AI seems to have a bias towards science, in at least in the regard of if I'm going and I'm saying, "Hey AI, help me find the best magnesium product," or help me find a natural product that is going to be good for my skin, right? It does tend to have a bias towards like validation in some sense. So that can be something, again, like going all the way back to like what's your commercial strategy for a clinical trial. That could even be part of your reason that you're doing it, is to say like we want our own clinical trial on our particular branded ingredient or our particular finished product because we believe that having that greater level of evidence is going to make it easier for our customers and bias our customers towards finding us in that kind of discovery.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, Sheena, I have a question for you. And this was not on your prep sheet, but we talked about it, so I hope it's okay. If there were one more question you could ask to try to ascertain if this CRO is a good partner, what's something else you try to discern before you would recommend partnering with a CRO organization?
Oh, one of the things that I want to know is that the CRO is going to be honest with me about what their limitations are. So CROs are always going to tell you how great they are. That's their job. It's a business. Um, but I want to know that they're going to be truthful about we don't have this expertise. And then ideally, but we can help you find it. Or, but we will get it. Or we will work with you on it. Or just to simply say, this is probably beyond us or outside of our expertise and we're not going to be a good partner. And just be honest. I think that's a really important quality.
That's great. We did have a couple questions in the chat that I think I'd love to pivot to. So this first one is, companies often have the budget to conduct only one clinical study. How can they maximize the value of that study within that limited budget, particularly when determining the sample size and selecting the most appropriate endpoints? It's a great question, and I know it's a pain point for many, many brands. I don't know if anybody wants to start the conversation, the answer. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
I mean, I bet that everyone wants to say something on this. I think, one of the first things I would be asking yourself, and this does depend a little bit on who you are. Are you an ingredient company? Are you a finished goods company? But it's partly the same answer is, you know, what is your intent again of what you want to do with this at the end of the day? It might just be that that a perception study and really just something that would be more along the lines of what we think of as a marketing study is all you really need to accomplish your goals. It might be kind of, I think, Paige said this, that maybe you only have the budget for a small pilot, but that's going to give you enough of a signal to either go back to your board or whoever's making those decisions and argue either for a bigger budget for a more robust trial, or it might just tell you like, oh, we went in the wrong direction entirely, and boy, good thing we didn't spend $500,000 on that thing because that was the wrong question. I would also just put in here, this might not be the right place to make this comment, but I feel like I need to make it, is um, don't be myopic when you're thinking about these things, right? I don't care if you have the coolest technology in the world. If you, at the end of the day, your competition, wherever you are in that ecosystem, if you're an ingredient company, if that's other ingredients, if you're a brand, if that's, other closely matched brands in your space, if all you're going to be able to say about your product at the end of the day is um, supports gut health, then you have to think about that expense that you're going to put into a clinical trial um, versus what is everything else in your closely competitive landscape saying about their product? What are they like? What's defensible, and what's the price point that you're going up against, right? So if you can only make the end of the day, no matter how good your science is, the exact same claim as a company that can sell their ingredient for a cost in use of 2 cents. And you already know that your cost in use is going to be 10 cents or 15 cents or 18 cents. You might want to go back to the drawing board and really think, first of all, are we studying the right ingredient or product in our portfolio? Are we actually doing the right kind of science to get something that is, again, commercially defensible for what we're doing? And by commercially defensible, I mean, are you going to have a customer for it, at the price point that you're going to need to put it into the world? So I would add that.
I think that's a fantastic answer as a starting point. And if the answer to that is yes, we do still want to do a study, from a study design standpoint, I think I would emphasize that a study does not have to be complicated to be valuable. So what is the simplest way that you can get to the endpoints that you need? Doing careful power evaluations so that you know that you're not, like Jacqueline mentioned earlier, you're not getting a bunch of extra people that you don't need, but you're making sure that you do have that kind of minimum number covered. And I had one other thought that I lost, so I will let someone else speak for a moment and I'll mention it if I remember.
And I'll just add on to that. When you're thinking about the design of a study with a limited budget, is thinking about sub-studies. You don't necessarily need to have every single participant in your study get a blood draw, have the additional biomarker. If you're trying to do a pilot, like you can do a pilot within a consumer perception study, maybe. So you can get creative with that limited budget to try to get the information that you need to either have those conversations about getting a bigger budget down the line or to just meet those commercial goals that you have.
I
Paige,
remember.
talking to you when I first joined People Science, I had such a light bulb that you came from a pharma clinical background, and you said big pharma never starts with a huge, multi-million dollar trial, full RCT with hundreds of participants when they're first investigating something. But that's the way that the nutraceuticals industry has had to operate because of our limited budgets and because of the costs of clinical trials. So being able to start with a pilot, which is what big pharma would do. Where are you seeing signal? Follow the breadcrumbs so that your data is directing what your next phase of discovery is. That's the wise investment. That was such an aha moment when I was talking to because that isn't how our industry has traditionally operated because of the bandwidth and budget problems. Great answers. We have another question, and actually, Paige, you might be the best person for this too. How could a DCT CRO guarantee that the data entered by a subject uh, is not faked? That if a subject says that they're a male, that they're actually a male.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that somebody asked this question because I think that is one of the big questions we get in the decentralized space is quality. Regardless of if we're working in the dietary supplement, ingredient supplier, brand side, or in pharmaceuticals, it's is this high quality data? Is this real data? And where we get into that is identity verification. So usually at the beginning of a study, this is a question to ask the CROs is what's their method of identity verification for their participants? You can absolutely do this in a remote setting with anybody coming in so that you can confirm that a male subject who's answering male is a male subject. So that's one piece. The other thing is monitoring during the study. How are they monitoring to make sure that that data that is being collected is reasonable within the course, like during the course of the study? So they're not answering 10, 10, 10, 10, 10 every single time. So having that built into the analysis and the data cleaning process and the monitoring process while the study is ongoing so that you don't get into an issue at the end of the study where you have all this data and you're cleaning it and you're saying, oh, it's not real. So having those monitoring pieces set up early, which you absolutely can. And this is also where the tech and what your CRO is using in a decentralized model comes into play. So one of the big things that I learned early in my research career is Alcoa. So making sure that everything is attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and I think did I say attributable already? Um, and accurate. Accurate's the last one. Um, So making sure that it's attributable to the person entering the data. So are they just doing it through an email? Are they texting it? Is this secure data entry that you can make sure, oh no, it's the person who's logged in to this platform that is entering the data as the subject in this study. So those are all pieces to think about in a decentralized model to make sure that the data you're getting is real.
Wonderful. Oh, thank you so much, Paige. Well, we're right at the end of our hour. So Gilmar has one final quick Zoom poll for us that he's going to share right now. So after today's session, how comfortable do you feel choosing a CRO? Let us know. And we'll get those results. Excellent. I'm so glad that people feel very comfortable choosing the right CRO partner. And if you have any additional questions, you can reach out to us at ask@peoplescience.health. You can scan here and you'll get your CRO comparison framework worksheet with a lot of the information we talked about today. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you very, very much to Dr. Jacqueline Jacques, to Sheena Smith, to Paige Oliver for sharing all their expertise. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you next time.